Christians are called to respond to tragedy with compassion and empathy and love. But what do we do when the tragedy itself is actually being celebrated by the culture at large, by the mainstream media, by our own government, and even by some within Christian circles? How do we stand for truth when truth seems to be the primary victim of the tragedy? Recently, we all know that a shooter invaded an elementary school in Nashville, Tennessee, and killed 3 adult staff members and 3 9-year-old children. It's been fascinating to watch the response to what is not just another school shooting, but a shooting that happened to be perpetrated by someone suffering from the delusion that is transgenderism. What's been most disturbing about all of this is that the children have sort of been lost in the conversation as our world at large seems to be acting like it's the shooter who is the victim here. We shouldn't be surprised because we actually see it in a number of different cases. For example, President Joe Biden's commitment to the moral revolution has never been in doubt. From his time as a presidential candidate to today, after 2+ years in office, he has aggressively and energetically supported the objectives of the LGBT activists. But it's interesting that he has even gone to the place where his views are that minor children should have access to what is euphemistically referred to as gender transition procedures. Now, in case you don't know what that is, a gender transition procedure is the physical mutilation of a not yet mature body in permanent ways based on the idea that a child somehow is malformed psychologically. President Biden spoke recently about a Florida law that has just been passed that would prevent those kinds of medical procedures from being applied to minor children. And the president, partly forgetting what is in the purview of states' rights, he, interestingly enough, used theological language to attempt to frame the conversation as if he was invoking the very justice of God himself in this question. What he said was, barring children from cross-sex hormones and puberty-blocking drugs, he said is not only wrong, but here's the quote, he said it's almost sinful. Now that's fascinating because while the president has claimed to be Catholic, he's obviously not a good Catholic, but he's claimed to be Catholic and he invokes theological language occasionally. What he's done here is he's used theological language to try and make the argument that people who are attempting to prevent the physical mutilation of children are almost sinful. Now, one of the things I'd love to tell the president is that while he thinks he's using biblical language, there is no category in the Bible for actions that are almost sinful. There are not degrees, there are not gradations of sin. Something is sinful or it's not sinful. But the very idea that preventing gender reassignment surgeries for minors is almost sinful is nothing more than his attempt to invoke a moral authority beyond himself to hold to a position that until just a couple of years ago would have been universally recognized as the most bizarre position an American president could hold. It's not just that. Recently, to celebrate International Women's Day, the Biden White House gave a series of awards to honor women who have done something spectacular to advance the cause of equal rights and equal value for women globally. Let me just give you some examples of the recipients of the honor. Meza Mohammed is a woman who works on behalf of women in Ethiopia who have experienced sexual assault and gender-based violence. She's been arrested multiple times as she has defended women and tried to help build protections for them in a culture that views women as property. Hadil Abdel Aziz is a woman who lives in Jordan. She founded the Justice Center for Legal Aid, and she works in that country to defend the most marginalized people in the nation, including juveniles, refugees, migrants, and especially female victims, survivors of sexual assault. She's doing amazing work in a hard place. Dr. Zakira Hekmat works in the nation of Afghanistan, where she works with women, girls, and minorities to help them receive access to protection under the guise of what is called the Afghan Refugee Solidarity Association. These are 3 of 10 women who are doing incredible work around the globe to protect women from the most vicious kinds of dangers that women often suffer, particularly in what we term third world nations. In this list of extraordinary women, the Biden White House had the audacity to include, as a woman of courage, a man. This man's name is Alba Rueda. He's a biological male from Argentina. He's a transgender activist who is the first Argentine undersecretary for diversity policies in that country's Ministry of Women, Gender, and Diversity. In other words, he doesn't even work with women. He is a man pretending to be a woman who serves in a government that has now established a branch of government to facilitate the rights of other men who pretend to be women. He actually received an award on International Women's Day for his work. My argument would be that by accepting an award on International Women's Day, this man actually contributed to the inequality that women suffer worldwide. The first male ever awarded an honor on International Women's Day pretending to be a woman. Author J.K. Rowling has taken a lot of heat because of her attitudes towards gender, but she says if sex isn't real, the lived reality of women globally is erased. Those who identify as transgender women are still creations of a good God, but they are not female. They do not know what it means to be a woman, and they certainly aren't qualified to push deserving biological women out of the way, as is increasingly happening in sports, in government, and now even in humanitarianism. Hopefully when Mr. Rueda went home to Argentina, he knew in his heart that he didn't really deserve that award, because the rest of us, we know that already. Well, then there are churches. There is a church in Fargo, North Dakota called St. Mark's Lutheran Church. St. Mark's Lutheran Church is pastored by transgender pastor Micah Luegi. Pastor Micah is a biological woman living in a lesbian relationship with another woman, masquerading as a male pastor. Well, that's ridiculous enough in itself. But in a message preached last Sunday, she compared the treatment of transgender murderer Audrey Hale, the Nashville shooter. She compared Audrey Hale, the treatment she has received posthumously, to the treatment of Jesus as he approached the cross on Good Friday. This speaker said this: the Jewish leaders were looking for any excuse, valid or not, to crucify Jesus, and they needed to kill him in order to preserve their good image. There are a significant number of people who have deemed that the fact that the Nashville shooter happened to be a trans person, so that it's reported, is just the excuse they need to call for the eradication of trans folks. Where have you seen anybody in Christian circles or even on the political right call for transgender human beings to be stood up and shot, executed, eradicated because of what happened in Nashville? This kind of over-the-top craziness is where we are. Here is a woman pretending to be a man who takes the example of a woman pretending to be a man who murdered 6 people, 3 of them 9-year-old children, and this so-called pastor says that person was just like Jesus, unjustly treated by the forces, the powers of the day. In fact, this pastor goes on to criticize so-called allies of the transgender movement who have abandoned and betrayed transgender persons the same way that Jesus' disciples abandoned him when he was arrested. Here's the thing. I understand what the Bible tells us about the way we respond to these people. We need to remember that our hope and our strength comes from God. In Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, we're told, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. I understand that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44 says, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I want us to love our enemies. I want us to pray for those who are celebrating evil. I want us to find our peace and our comfort by taking our burdens and our petitions to God. I believe all of that. But I have to tell you this as well. It's time for us to get angry. Being winsome and nice, playing nice with these kinds of issues is not an option any longer. I had a woman drive past my church years ago, and on the sign of our church was a Bible verse that simply said that God hates certain things. And she called me. She wasn't a member of my church. She was just driving past, and she called me and scolded me because I used the word hate. She said, I never teach that word to my children. And I said, well, ma'am, the Bible is pretty clear that there's some things that God hates. And if you're saying there's nothing at all that you could hate, you are not standing where God stands. She said, well, I just think that your church must be a hateful place. Well, here's what I think. We're commanded to hate the things that God hates. Let me just give you some verses. Proverbs 8:13, to fear the Lord is to hate evil. He says, I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior, and perverse speech. Romans 12:9, love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Psalm 101, verse 3, I will not look with approval on anything that is vile, God says. I hate what faithless people do. I will have no part in it. Amos 5:15, hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts. Proverbs 13:5, the righteous hate what is false, but the wicked make themselves a stench and bring shame on themselves. Psalm 119, verse 104, I gain understanding from your precepts, O Lord, therefore I hate every wrong path. When we hate evil, we are refusing to allow it to have a foothold in our lives. And when we dance around it like we don't want to be seen as unkind, what we do is we actually make evil more dangerous. If you were to take a bottle of rat poison and label it as chocolate syrup, have you made it less dangerous? No, you've made it more dangerous because it's not clear the consequences of drinking out of that bottle. We live in a time where it's time. We don't want to be ugly. We're not meant to be hateful. But it's time that we get some backbone in the Christian community and begin to hate the things that God hates. Why are we where we are as a nation? Well, it's because evil men are in control. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Why are evil men in control? Because the church has been so nice that we've been afraid to stand for truth. We've been afraid to hate the things that God hates. Let me tell you something I hate. I don't hate this transgender pastor in North Dakota. But I do hate that such people take the Word of God and twist it and pervert it in such obviously bizarre ways as to not even mean anything at all what the Bible meant. Really? This murderer in Nashville is like Jesus? She's been betrayed by people who just have to kill her in order to build themselves up. The president says it's almost sinful to try and prevent children from being physically mutilated by misguided medical procedures for a psychological disorder. I'm fed up. I'm not going to be unkind, but I'm not going to be nice anymore either. We better hate what God hates, or we will find that we'll be on the wrong side of this issue, and God will even begin to hate what we do, which is nothing in the face of open, uncompromising wickedness. Don't be ugly. Don't be mean. Don't target people as objects of hate. But there are some agendas, there are some attitudes, there are some actions out there that we are on firm biblical ground to say that God hates those things. And friends, we better hate those things too. If you want to tell me that you don't hate anything or anybody, or there's nothing that you hate, that you just love the whole world, then let me tell you something, you're not standing where God stands. And you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of eternity. When God says, why did you take my clear, unconfused word about my nature and decide that you knew best? This is Truth Currents.